The drone feed flickered to black at 3:47 hours, and in that moment, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Raven Thorne knew something was terribly wrong. The MQ-9 Reaper had been circling the convoy route for 3 hours, its infrared sensors painting the desert in ghostly white and gray. Now, nothing but static filled the screens in the command bunker at Forward Operating Base Meridian. "Raven, what's your status on Falcon 7? The voice crackled through her headset, tinged with the kind of forced calm that preceded disasters. She leaned forward, her fingers dancing across the control interface with practiced precision. The joystick felt foreign in her hands. 6 months of forced desk duty had made her fingers soft, her reflexes sluggish. But muscle memory ran deeper than bureaucratic punishment, and within seconds she was troubleshooting the connection protocols. "Falcon 7 is dark, control. Lost telemetry at 0347. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone who had learned to speak carefully around superior officers, attempting to re-establish link. Behind her, Major Harrison shifted in his chair. She could feel his eyes on her back, heavy with the weight of their shared history. 3 weeks ago, he had been the one to sign the disciplinary action that grounded her from flying missions. Insubordination, the file said. Reckless endangerment of assets. What it didn't say was that she had saved 37 lives by disobeying a direct order. The convoy was 12 miles out, threading through the coast province valleys like a metal serpent. 43 Marines, 2 embedded journalists, and a cargo of medical supplies destined for a remote outpost. Standard resupply run. Routine. The kind of mission that should have been boring. But the drone going dark changed everything. "Raven," Harrison's voice was quiet, meant only for her. "The convoy doesn't know they're flying blind." She turned, meeting his gaze for the first time in weeks. His weathered face showed the strain of command, but something else flickered behind his eyes, a question he couldn't ask aloud. "Are you still the pilot who saved Alpha Company? Are you still the woman who could thread a Blackhawk through a sandstorm while taking fire?" The radio crackled. "Meridian Base, this is Convoy Actual. ETA to checkpoint in 15 mics. Request final approach clearance." Raven's hands stilled on the controls. Without the drone's overwatch, the convoy was moving blind through territory that had claimed 6 vehicles in the past month. The Taliban knew these routes, knew exactly where to place their IEDs for maximum effect. "Control, this is Raven. I need authorization to attempt manual recovery of Falcon 7. The silence stretched like a held breath. Everyone in the bunker knew what she was really asking for. She wanted to fly again. The desert wind whispered against the bunker's reinforced walls, carrying the scent of dust and distant smoke. In the green glow of the monitoring screens, Raven looked like a ghost of her former self, thinner, paler, but with the same steel-gray eyes that had once earned her the grudging respect of every pilot in the squadron. Major Harrison reached for his radio, his finger hovering over the transmit button. The decision he made in the next 30 seconds would either save 43 lives or end both their careers. The convoy was 11 miles out and closing fast. "Negative, Raven, you're grounded." But she was already moving, her fingers flying across the backup console with desperate precision. If she couldn't fly, she would find another way. The drone was still out there, somewhere in the digital ether, and she was going to bring it home. The convoy pushed deeper into the valley, unaware that their guardian angel had gone silent. Above them, the morning sky stretched endless and blue, beautiful and treacherous as a siren's song. Soon, that sky would be filled with the thunder of rotor blades and the desperate prayers of soldiers who had learned that survival was never guaranteed. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Thorne had 18 minutes to become a hero again. But first, she had to commit the greatest act of insubordination in her military career. The clock on the wall ticked toward 400 hours, and somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains, 43 Marines rolled toward their fate, trusting that someone, somewhere, was watching over them. They had no idea that their fate rested in the hands of a grounded pilot who had nothing left to lose. The screen flickered once, twice, then bloomed with the familiar thermal signature of the convoy. Raven had found her bird. Now she had to steal it back from whatever had taken it. The real mission was just beginning. Major Harrison watched her work, his face a mask of professional concern hiding deeper currents of admiration and dread. He had seen Raven Thorn perform miracles before. He prayed she had one more left in her. The radio crackled again. Meridian Base, Convoy Actual, beginning final approach to Checkpoint Charlie, all quiet on the Eastern Front. All quiet if only they knew. Raven's fingers found the emergency override sequence, a series of commands that would either restore the drone's connection or trigger a cascade failure that would ground every MQ-9 in the theater. She looked at Harrison one last time, seeking permission she already knew he couldn't give. "Raven, don't." His voice was barely a whisper. "You're walking into a court-martial." She smiled, and for a moment, the weight of the past 6 months lifted from her shoulders. "Sir, respectfully, I've been walking toward a court-martial since the day I put on these wings." Her finger moved toward the override key, and the fate of 43 Marines hung in the balance. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of helicopter rotors warming up for the dawn patrol. The sound made her heart ache with longing. The desert had claimed too many good soldiers already. Today, it would not claim any more. The thermal imaging screen showed the convoy as a string of white-hot rectangles moving through the gray landscape, beautiful and vulnerable, like candles in a hurricane. Raven had sworn an oath to protect them, and no amount of disciplinary action would make her forget that promise. She pressed the override key, and the war began anew. The connection stabilized immediately, flooding the screen with high-definition imagery from 12,000 feet. The MQ-9 Reaper had been flying in autonomous mode, its AI systems maintaining altitude and course, while the communication link remained severed. But now something else appeared on the screen, movement in the rocks above the convoy route, the distinctive heat signatures of human forms carrying metallic objects. "Jesus Christ," Harrison breathed, leaning over her shoulder. "How many?" Raven's fingers flew across the targeting controls, switching between thermal and optical sensors. The picture that emerged made her blood run cold. 27 figures positioned along a 1,000-meter stretch of road, with heavy weapons and what looked like improvised explosive devices already in place. "It's an ambush," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "They're walking into a kill zone." The convoy was 8 miles out, maybe 10 minutes at their current speed. The Taliban had chosen their position perfectly, a natural choke point where the road narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. No room to maneuver, no escape routes, just a straight shot into hell. "Get me General Morrison," Harrison barked to the communications operator. "Priority Alpha." But Raven was already moving, her hands switching the drone to manual control. The MQ-9 responded like a thoroughbred under the touch of a skilled jockey, banking smoothly into a combat approach vector. The Hellfire missiles slung beneath its wings were armed and ready, their targeting systems syncing with her control inputs. "Raven, what are you doing?" Harrison's voice carried a note of panic. "You don't have authorization for weapons release." "The convoy doesn't have authorization to die either," she replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Convoy Actual, this is Meridian Base. Immediate halt. Immediate halt. You have multiple hostiles in overwatch positions." The radio crackled with confusion. "Meridian Base, Convoy Actual, say again. We're showing green on all approaches." Because they couldn't see what she could see. The Taliban fighters were invisible to ground-based sensors, hidden in the rocks like deadly spiders waiting for flies. But from 12,000 feet, with thermal imaging and a pilot who knew how to read the signs, they might as well have been wearing neon signs. Major Harrison stood frozen, caught between duty and conscience. The rules of engagement were clear. No weapons release without authorization from at least a full colonel. But the convoy was 7 miles out, and General Morrison was probably in a briefing 3 time zones away. "Raven, I can't let you do this." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. It was the same look she'd worn 6 months ago when she disobeyed orders to save Alpha Company. The look of a warrior who had found her line in the sand. "Then don't let me, sir. Court-martial me. Ground me for life. But don't let those Marines die because we were too afraid to break some rules." The drone's cameras tracked the convoy as it approached the kill zone. Through the thermal imaging, she could see the individual heat signatures of the Marines inside their vehicles, trusting in their training, their equipment, and the unseen guardian angels who were supposed to be watching over them. Harrison reached for his sidearm, a gesture that spoke of regulations and procedures and the weight of command. But his hand stopped halfway to his holster, trembling with the impossibility of the choice before him. 6 miles out, the convoy commander reported. All systems green, requesting permission to proceed to Checkpoint Charlie. Raven's finger hovered over the weapons release authorization. One word from Harrison would stop her. One word from him would condemn 43 Marines to death. The silence stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss. In the distance, she could hear the other drone operators talking quietly among themselves, their voices carrying the nervous energy of people who sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Do it," Harrison whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. She pressed the authorization key, and the Hellfire missile dropped from the MQ-9's wing like a falling star. The thermal bloom on the screen was immediate and devastating, erasing 3 Taliban fighters in a flash of white-hot destruction. The shockwave rolled through the rocks, sending debris tumbling into the valley below. "Meridian Base, what the hell was that?" The convoy commander's voice was sharp with alarm. "Convoy Actual, this is Meridian Base. You are danger close to multiple hostile positions. Recommend immediate reverse course and hold position for CAS support." The second missile was already in the air, tracking toward a cluster of fighters positioned near what looked like a command post. The explosion lit up the morning sky like a new sun, and through the drone's cameras, Raven could see the survivors scrambling for cover. But 27 fighters was too many for 2 missiles. The survivors were regrouping, adapting their positions, preparing for a fight that would cost American lives no matter how it ended. "Raven, you need to call in close air support," Harrison said, his voice tight with stress. "We need fast movers, heavy guns." "Negative, sir. The closest F-16s are 40 minutes out. The convoy doesn't have 40 minutes. She was already computing angles and distances, her mind running through the tactical options with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster. The MQ-9 carried 2 more Hellfires, enough to break up the ambush but not enough to eliminate it entirely. Unless... "I'm taking the drone down," she announced, her fingers already inputting the new flight parameters. "Down, Raven, that's a $60 million aircraft. It's also the only weapon we have that can reach them in time." The MQ-9 Reaper was never designed for close air support. Its cameras and sensors were built for high-altitude surveillance, its missiles for precision strikes against stationary targets. But Raven had trained on every aircraft in the Air Force inventory, had pushed each one to its limits and beyond. She brought the drone down to 8,000 feet, then 6, then 4. The Taliban fighters were firing at the convoy now, their muzzle flashes visible as bright stars against the thermal imaging. The Marines were returning fire, but they were trapped in their vehicles, unable to maneuver in the narrow passage. "Convoy Actual, this is Meridian Base. We have eyes on. Danger close fire mission incoming." The third Hellfire streaked down from the sky, impacting directly on a machine gun position that had been pouring fire into the lead vehicle. The explosion was followed by a secondary detonation, ammunition or explosives cooking off in the intense heat. But the drone was losing altitude too fast, its engine straining under the demands of low-level flight. Warning lights flashed across Raven's control console, and she could hear the distant whine of turbofans pushed beyond their operational limits. "Raven, you're losing the bird," Harrison warned. "I know." Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. "One more pass." The fourth and final Hellfire was reserved for the largest group of fighters, the ones who had been smart enough to stay hidden until the convoy was completely committed to the kill zone. They were good soldiers, well-trained and disciplined. Under different circumstances, she might have respected them. Today, they were just targets. The missile struck the center of their position, and the thermal bloom was so intense it temporarily whited out the drone's cameras. When the image cleared, the ambush was broken. Scattered figures were fleeing into the rocks, abandoning their weapons and their dead. "Convoy Actual, this is Meridian Base. Threat neutralized. You are cleared to proceed." The MQ-9 Reaper was dying around her, its systems failing one by one as the damaged engines finally gave out. But it had done its job. The convoy was moving again, rolling through the valley with their guardian angel falling from the sky behind them. Raven watched the altitude readings drop. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. The drone would crash somewhere in the mountains, its wreckage scattered across the same rocks that had sheltered the Taliban fighters. "Raven," Harrison said softly, "you know what this means." She nodded, her hands steady on the controls as she guided the dying aircraft away from populated areas. "Yes, sir, I know." The radio crackled with the convoy commander's voice. "Meridian Base, Convoy Actual. Whatever you just did, thank you. We're showing all clear on approach to Checkpoint Charlie." 43 Marines would see another sunrise. Their families would receive letters instead of folded flags. Children would have fathers come home, wives would have husbands, mothers would have sons. The cost would be her career, her freedom, and possibly her life. But as she watched the convoy disappear into the distance, safe and alive, Raven Thorn knew she had made the right choice. The MQ-9 Reaper struck the mountainside at 4:23 hours, taking with it $60 million of taxpayer money and the last hope of avoiding a court-martial. The explosion echoed through the valley like distant thunder, and then there was only silence. Major Harrison stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It was the right call, Raven. History will remember that." She smiled, thinking of the 43 Marines who would never know how close they had come to death. "History doesn't matter, sir. They're alive. That's what matters." Outside, the sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was going to be a beautiful day. The military police arrived at 4:45 hours, their faces grim with the weight of duty. They moved with professional courtesy, placing the handcuffs gently on Raven's wrists while reading her rights in voices that carried no malice, only sadness. "Lieutenant Commander Thorn," the MP sergeant said, "you're under arrest for destruction of government property, disobedience of direct orders, and unauthorized use of military assets." She nodded, accepting the charges with the same calm she had shown while saving 43 lives. "I understand, Sergeant." As they led her away, she caught sight of the other drone operators standing at attention. Their faces showed a mixture of respect, fear, and something else, pride. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when one person's courage had stood between innocent lives and certain death. The bunker fell silent after her departure, the only sound the soft hum of electronic equipment and the distant whisper of wind across the desert. On the screens, other drones continued their lonely vigil, their cameras scanning the endless landscape for signs of threat. But everyone knew that something had changed in that underground command center. The rules hadn't changed. They never did. But the people who followed them had been reminded that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. Major Harrison sat alone at the control station, staring at the blank screen where Falcon 7's camera feed had been. In a few hours, he would face his own review board, his own questions about command decisions and proper procedure. But right now, he was thinking about 43 Marines who were alive because one woman had chosen to be a warrior instead of a soldier. There was a difference, he realized. Soldiers followed orders. Warriors saved lives. The convoy reached Checkpoint Charlie at 500 hours, their vehicles dusty but intact, their cargo secure. The Marines climbed out of their trucks, stretching in the morning sun, joking about the close call they didn't fully understand. None of them would learn the full story for months, not until the court-martial proceedings made the details public. But even then, they would struggle to comprehend the choice that had been made for them, the willingness of one person to sacrifice everything for the lives of strangers. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Raven Thorne was processed into the detention facility at 5:30 hours. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and given a gray jumpsuit in exchange for her flight suit. The transformation was symbolic. The warrior had become a prisoner. The protector had become the protected. Her cell was small but clean, with a narrow window that looked out toward the mountains where the MQ-9 Reaper had met its end. She could see the smoke still rising from the crash site, a dark column against the brightening sky. The guards were respectful, even deferential. Word had already spread through the base about what she had done, and among the enlisted ranks she was becoming something of a legend. The pilot who had saved a convoy by stealing a drone, the woman who had chosen court-martial over cowardice. Her first visitor was the base chaplain, a soft-spoken man who offered spiritual comfort and practical advice. "The JAG officer will be here this afternoon," he said. "Colonel Martinez, she's good people." Raven nodded, appreciating the kindness but not needing it. She had made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences. The legal process would unfold as it must, but her conscience was clear. "Chaplain," she said, "can you tell me about the convoy? Are they all right?" His smile was gentle. "They're safe, Lieutenant Commander, all 43 of them. They're asking about you actually. Want to know who their guardian angel was." Guardian angel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Angels were supposed to be pure, holy, obedient to divine will. She had been none of those things. She had been human, flawed, willing to sin for the sake of salvation. The afternoon brought Colonel Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen too much of both war and peace. She sat across from Raven in the interview room, her briefcase open, her expression neutral. "Let's start with the basics," Martinez said. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, ma'am. I destroyed government property, disobeyed direct orders, and used military assets without authorization." "And how do you plead?" Raven met her gaze steadily. "Guilty, ma'am, to all charges." Martinez made a note, her pen scratching across the legal pad. "That's refreshingly honest. Most pilots in your position would try to argue justification, necessity, some kind of defense." "I'm not most pilots, ma'am. I did what I did with full knowledge of the consequences. I'd do it again." "Even knowing it would end your career?" "Even knowing it would end my life." The colonel studied her for a long moment, and Raven got the impression she was being evaluated not just as a defendant but as a person. "Tell me about your call sign," Martinez said finally. "Raven, how did you get it?" The question caught her off guard. "Ma'am." "Your call sign. In my experience, call signs tell stories. I want to hear yours." Raven leaned back in her chair, her mind drifting to a different time, a different war. "Flight school, ma'am. I was the only woman in my class and I had a habit of appearing where I wasn't supposed to be." Appearing. I'd study the other students' flight patterns, learn their weaknesses, their blind spots. Then I'd show up in their six when they least expected it. The instructors said I was like a raven, always watching, always circling, always ready to strike. Martinez smiled, and the other meaning. Ma'am. Ravens are messengers, Lieutenant Commander. In mythology, they carry words between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They're psychopomps, guides for souls in transition. The observation hit deeper than Raven had expected. I hadn't thought of it that way, ma'am. No, because that's exactly what you did today. You carried a message from the world of the living to 43 Marines who were about to enter the world of the dead. You guided them safely through that transition. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering technical details, procedural violations, and the complex legal framework that would determine her fate. But Raven found herself thinking about the colonel's words long after the session ended. A psychopomp, a guide for souls in transition. Perhaps that was what she had always been, even before she knew it. The pilot who showed up when death was circling, who stood between the living and the void. That evening she was allowed to make phone calls. The first was to her mother, a difficult conversation filled with tears and recriminations. The second was to her former squadron commander, who listened in silence before saying simply, "I'm proud of you, Raven. Whatever happens next, I'm proud of you." The third call was to Major Harrison, who answered on the first ring. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine, sir. How's the investigation going?" "Thorough. They're talking to everyone who was in the bunker, reviewing all the radio traffic, analyzing the drone footage. The good news is that the convoy commander is backing your version of events. He's calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero, sir. I just did my job." "No, Raven, you did more than your job. You did what was right even when it was hard. That's the definition of heroism." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the static on the line. "Sir, I want you to know I don't regret it. Not the drone, not the missiles, not any of it. Those Marines deserve to live." "I know, and for what it's worth, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." "Sir, I was grounded. I wasn't even supposed to be flying." "You weren't flying, Lieutenant Commander. You were saving lives. There's a difference." The line went quiet, and Raven found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been one of the Air Force's most promising pilots. Now she was facing a court-martial that would likely end with a dishonorable discharge and possible imprisonment. But 43 Marines were alive. Their families would sleep soundly tonight, unaware of how close they had come to tragedy. Children would grow up with fathers, wives would grow old with husbands, and the world would continue turning because one woman had chosen to break the rules. "Sir," she said finally, "if they offer me a deal, reduced charges, light sentence, I'm not taking it. I want this to go to trial." "Raven, that's not necessarily in your best interest." "Maybe not, but it's in the interest of every pilot who might face this choice someday. They need to know that someone stood up and said that saving lives is more important than following orders." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "You know they're calling you the guardian angel of Coast, don't you?" "I've heard rumors." "It's more than rumors. Someone leaked the drone footage to the media. The whole thing, the ambush, the missile strikes, the drone crash, it's all over the news." Raven felt a chill of apprehension. "That's not good, sir. The Air Force doesn't like publicity." "No, but the American people love heroes. And right now, you're the biggest hero in uniform." She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Heroes were supposed to be noble, selfless, pure. She was just a pilot who had made a hard choice and was living with the consequences. "Sir, I have to go, but thank you for everything." "Raven, for what it's worth, I think you're going to change how we think about warfare. What you did today, it's not going to be forgotten." She hung up the phone and returned to her cell, where she sat on the narrow bed and stared out at the mountains. The smoke from the crashed drone had dissipated, leaving only the eternal peaks and the endless sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: lawyers, reporters, politicians who would try to use her story for their own purposes. But tonight, she was just a woman who had saved 43 lives and was willing to pay the price for that salvation. The mountain stood silent sentinel over the valley, and somewhere in the darkness, the wind carried the sound of helicopters returning to base. The sound made her heart ache with longing, but also with a strange sense of peace. She had been grounded for disobedience, but she had found her wings in a different kind of flight. She had learned that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty was disobedience, that sometimes the highest honor was dishonor. And she had discovered that a warrior's greatest weapon was not a missile or a gun, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for the lives of others. The trial would come, the judgment would be rendered, and history would decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that 43 Marines were alive, and the world was a little bit brighter because one woman had chosen to be a guardian angel instead of a good soldier. Outside her window, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Lieutenant Commander Rebecca, Raven, Thorne closed her eyes and dreamed of flying. The news broke at 600 hours the next morning, when CNN led with the story of the guardian angel of Coast. The footage was grainy but dramatic: thermal imaging of the ambush, the missile strikes, the convoy's narrow escape. The anchor's voice was grave as he described the court-martial of the pilot who had saved 43 lives. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media, with hashtags like Guardian Angel and Save Raven trending worldwide. The Pentagon's phones were ringing constantly, with reporters demanding interviews and families of the rescued Marines calling to express their gratitude. In her cell, Raven was unaware of the media storm brewing around her. She had spent the night in fitful sleep, her dreams filled with the sound of rotor blades and the distant rumble of explosions. She woke to find a guard standing at her cell door, his face serious. "Lieutenant Commander, you have visitors. The base commander wants to see you." She was escorted to a conference room where General Morrison sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by colonels and majors she didn't recognize. The general was a small man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Raven took the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She had met Morrison only once before, at a ceremony honoring the pilots who had saved Alpha Company. He had seemed impressed by her then, but that was before she had destroyed a $60 million drone. "Do you know why you're here?" Morrison asked. "I assume it's about the charges, sir." "Partially, but mostly it's about the shitstorm you've created." He gestured to a stack of newspapers on the table. "Your front-page news, Lieutenant Commander, the guardian angel of Coast, the pilot who saved a convoy by hijacking a drone." Raven glanced at the headlines, feeling a mixture of pride and dread. "I didn't hijack anything, sir. I used emergency protocols to regain control of a military asset." "Semantics. The point is you've become a symbol. Half the country thinks you're a hero, the other half thinks you're a traitor. The president's been briefed. Congress is asking questions, and I'm caught in the middle." Morrison leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer. Do you regret what you did?" Raven met his gaze without flinching. "No, sir. I regret the necessity of it, but not the action itself. Even knowing it would end your career. Even knowing it would end my life." The general studied her for a long moment, and she got the impression he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You know, Lieutenant Commander, I've been in the military for 37 years. I've seen heroes and cowards, saints and sinners, but I've never seen anyone quite like you." Sorry. You're willing to sacrifice everything for people you've never met. That's not just courage, it's something deeper. It's moral clarity. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where the drone had crashed. The thing is, the Air Force doesn't know what to do with moral clarity. We're designed for obedience, efficiency, following orders. But sometimes the orders are wrong. Yes, sir. The good news is that public opinion is strongly in your favor. The bad news is that doesn't matter in a court-martial. The law is the law, and you broke it. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression thoughtful. But there might be another way. The Secretary of Defense has authorized me to offer you a deal. Raven felt her heart skip. What kind of deal, sir? Full pardon, reinstatement to active duty, and a promotion to major. In exchange, you agree to testify before Congress about drone warfare ethics and help us develop new rules of engagement. It was more than she had dared hope for. Freedom, vindication, the chance to fly again. All she had to do was accept the offer and move on with her life. What about the precedent, sir? If I accept a pardon, doesn't that send the message that it's okay to disobey orders as long as you have good intentions? Morrison smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this mess. Most people would take the deal and run. I'm not most people, sir. No, you're not. Which is why I'm also authorized to offer you an alternative. Sorry. Court-martial, full military trial, all the publicity that comes with it. If you're convicted, you'll face up to 20 years in prison. If you're acquitted, you'll be the most famous pilot in the Air Force. Raven considered the options. The safe choice was obvious. Take the pardon, accept the promotion, and spend the rest of her career as a symbol of reformed military justice. But the safe choice wasn't always the right choice. I want the trial, sir. Morrison nodded as if he had expected that answer. You realize you're gambling with your entire future. I'm gambling with my future, sir. But I'm investing in the future of every pilot who might face this choice someday. And if you lose? Then I lose honorably, sir. But at least I'll have stood up for what's right. The general gathered his papers, signaling the end of the meeting. Lieutenant Commander, you're either the most courageous pilot I've ever met or the most foolish. I'm not sure which. With respect, sir, I think they might be the same thing. As she was escorted back to her cell, Raven felt a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice, accepted the consequences, and now she would face whatever came next with dignity and grace. The trial was scheduled for 30 days hence, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Colonel Martinez would defend her, arguing that she had acted within the bounds of military necessity. The prosecution would argue that she had willfully disobeyed orders and destroyed government property. But Raven knew the real trial would be in the court of public opinion, where her story would be told and retold until it became legend. She would be remembered not as Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Thorne, but as the guardian angel of Coast, the pilot who had saved 43 lives by hijacking a drone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire career trying to prove that she was more than just a symbol, more than just a token female pilot. Now she would be remembered as the ultimate symbol, the warrior who had chosen conscience over compliance. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps being a symbol was its own form of service, its own way of protecting the innocent and defending the defenseless. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters returning from patrol, their rotors beating against the thin air. The sound filled her with longing, but also with hope. Somewhere out there, other pilots were making the same choice she had made, to stand between the innocent and the void, to be guardians and protectors and warriors for peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, She was content to sit in her cell and remember the faces of 43 Marines who would see another dawn. The first letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a guard who seemed almost reverent as he handed it through the cell bars. The envelope was creased and stained, bearing the postmark of a small town in Nebraska. Inside, written in careful block letters, were the words of a 19-year-old private named Marcus Chen. "Dear Lieutenant Commander Thorne," it began, "I don't know if you remember me, but I was in the second vehicle in the convoy. I wanted to thank you for saving my life. I have a baby daughter at home, and because of what you did, I'll get to see her grow up. I'll never forget what you sacrificed for us." More letters followed. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They came from the families of the rescued Marines, from veterans who understood the weight of command decisions, from civilians who had been moved by her story. Each one was a small reminder that her choice had rippled outward, touching lives she would never know. The media attention intensified as the trial date approached. Reporters camped outside the base, seeking interviews with anyone who had worked with her. Television pundits debated the ethics of her actions, while social media exploded with supporters and detractors arguing about military justice and the rules of war. But in the quiet of her cell, Raven found herself thinking not about fame or controversy, but about the moment she had pressed that override key. In that instant, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She had become something new, not just a pilot but a guardian, not just a soldier but a protector. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and strangely liberating. Colonel Martinez visited daily, preparing for the trial with the methodical precision of a lawyer who understood that history was watching. "The prosecution's case is straightforward," she explained during one session. "You disobeyed orders, destroyed government property, and acted without authorization. Those are facts." "Yes, ma'am, they are. Our defense will focus on military necessity, the doctrine of competing harms, and the fundamental duty of a soldier to preserve life. We'll argue that you had no choice but to act." Raven shook her head. "No, Colonel, I had a choice. I could have followed orders and let those Marines die. I chose not to." "That's not a winning argument, Lieutenant Commander." "Maybe not, but it's the truth." Martinez studied her with the expression of a lawyer trying to understand a client who seemed determined to sabotage her own defense. "Why are you making this so difficult?" "Because if I claim I had no choice, I'm saying that any pilot in my position would have done the same thing. But that's not true. Most pilots would have followed orders. I chose to disobey them." "And you're proud of that choice?" "I'm at peace with it. There's a difference." The colonel gathered her papers with a sigh. "Lieutenant Commander, I've defended a lot of military personnel over the years. Most of them want to minimize their actions, claim they were just following orders or acting under duress. You're the first client I've had who seems determined to take maximum responsibility for her choices." "Maybe that's because I'm not trying to avoid responsibility. I'm trying to embrace it." As the trial date approached, Raven found herself drawn to the small window of her cell, watching the daily rhythms of the base. Pilots walked to their aircraft with the confident stride of warriors, maintainers worked with the quiet dedication of professionals, and the great machinery of military life continued its eternal rotation. But something had changed. She could see it in the way the younger pilots looked toward her cell, in the respectful nods of the guards, in the careful way her story was discussed in the mess halls and ready rooms. She had become a symbol, but more than that, she had become a question. What would you have done? The question hung in the air like smoke, forcing every pilot to confront the possibility that someday they might face the same choice. Orders or conscience, regulations or lives, the safe path or the right path. The night before the trial, she was visited by an unexpected guest. Chaplain Williams arrived with a small group of the rescued Marines, men whose faces she had seen only as thermal signatures on a drone camera. They stood in the corridor outside her cell, their dress uniforms crisp, their expressions solemn. "Lieutenant Commander," said the sergeant who had been the convoy commander, "we wanted to thank you, and to tell you that whatever happens tomorrow, we'll never forget what you did for us." She looked at their faces, young men who had seen too much war but who were still alive to tell about it. "I just did my job, Sergeant." "No, ma'am, you did more than your job. You did what was right even when it was hard." They presented her with a small wooden plaque, roughly carved but bearing the inscription, "To the Guardian Angel of Coast, from the Marines of Convoy 7, Semper Fi." As they filed out, Raven felt the weight of their gratitude settle on her shoulders like a mantle. She had saved their lives, but they had given her something equally precious, the knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning, that her choice had mattered. The trial began at 800 hours on a cold November morning. The courtroom was packed with reporters, military officers, and family members of the rescued Marines. General Morrison sat in the front row, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Raven Thorne entered the courtroom in her dress blues, her ribbons and wings gleaming in the fluorescent light. She walked with the measured pace of a pilot approaching her aircraft, calm and focused despite the cameras and the crowd. The charges were read with military precision: willful disobedience of orders, destruction of government property, unauthorized use of military assets. Each count carried a potential sentence of years in prison, a future measured in concrete walls and iron bars. But as she listened to the formal language of military justice, Raven found herself thinking about a different kind of measurement. 43 lives saved. 43 families spared the knock on the door, the folded flag, the hollow words of sympathy. The prosecution opened with a methodical presentation of the facts. Major Kevin Sullivan, the lead prosecutor, was a career JAG officer who understood that the law was the law regardless of outcomes or intentions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not about heroism or cowardice, right or wrong. It is about the fundamental principle that military discipline depends on the obedience of orders. The defendant, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, willfully and deliberately disobeyed direct orders from her superior officer. She destroyed a $60 million aircraft. She used military assets without authorization. These are not opinions or interpretations. They are facts." Colonel Martinez's opening was equally measured but focused on different truths. The defendant faced an impossible choice, she argued. Follow orders and watch 43 Marines die, or disobey orders and save their lives. She chose to save lives. That is not a crime. It is the highest calling of a warrior. The testimony unfolded over 3 days, each witness adding another layer to the complex tapestry of that morning in the command bunker. Major Harrison described the tension in the room, the desperate search for alternatives, the weight of command decisions. Lieutenant Commander Thorne asked for authorization to attempt manual recovery of the drone, he testified. "I denied that request because she was grounded, but when she restored the connection and we saw the ambush, everything changed." "Did you give her permission to fire the missiles?" Sullivan asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "I told her to do what she thought was right." "That's not what I asked, Major. Did you give her explicit permission to fire?" "No, I did not." The drone operators testified about the technical aspects of the override, the precision required to regain control of the aircraft, the skill needed to conduct close air support with a surveillance drone. Their testimony painted a picture of a pilot operating at the very edge of what was possible, pushing technology and training to their limits. "In your professional opinion," Martinez asked one of the operators, "could anyone else have done what Lieutenant Commander Thorne did?" "No, ma'am. She's the best pilot I've ever seen." The rescued Marines testified with obvious emotion. their voices thick with gratitude and respect. They described the ambush, the confusion, the moments when death seemed certain. They spoke of the explosions that saved their lives, the guardian angel they never saw but would never forget. "We were sitting ducks," said Private Chen, his voice barely above a whisper. "They had us dead to rights. If Lieutenant Commander Thorne hadn't acted, we'd all be dead." "Were you aware that she was disobeying orders?" Sullivan asked. "No, sir. We just knew someone was watching over us." The technical testimony was damning in its precision. The drone had been destroyed. The missiles had been fired without authorization. The rules of engagement had been violated. Each fact was presented with military efficiency, building a case that seemed unassailable. But something else was building in the courtroom, a sense that the law, however clear, was inadequate to judge the moral complexity of the situation. The jury, composed of senior officers who had faced their own impossible choices, listened with expressions that grew more thoughtful as the testimony continued. On the second day, the prosecution called Major General Patricia Wang, the commander of drone operations for the entire theater. She was a formidable woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had earned her stars through competence and dedication. "General Wang," Sullivan asked, "in your opinion, did Lieutenant Commander Thorne have any alternative to the action she took?" "She could have followed proper procedures. She could have contacted higher authority. She could have requested emergency authorization through established channels." "And how long would those procedures have taken?" 30 to 45 minutes under optimal conditions. "And the convoy would have been destroyed." Sullivan pressed the point. "But those procedures exist for a reason, correct? To prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized action." "Yes, military discipline depends on following orders, not on individual judgment calls." But Colonel Martinez's cross-examination revealed the complexity beneath the surface. "General Wang, how many drone operations have you overseen in your career?" "Approximately 15,000. "And in how many of those operations were you faced with an imminent threat to American lives that required immediate action?" Wang hesitated. "Several dozen." "And in each case, you had to make a judgment call about the appropriate response, correct? Within the bounds of established procedure." "But the procedures couldn't account for every possible scenario, could they?" "No, that's why we have commanders, to make difficult decisions." "And on the morning in question, Lieutenant Commander Thorne was the commander on the scene, was she not?" "She was not authorized to make that decision. But someone had to make it, and she was the only one who could." The exchange crystallized the central tension of the trial. The military ran on discipline, hierarchy, and the careful delegation of authority. But war was chaos, and chaos didn't respect organizational charts or proper procedures. The third day brought the most dramatic testimony, Lieutenant Commander Thorne herself. She took the stand in her dress blues, her bearing proud but not defiant. She answered questions with the same precision she had shown in the cockpit, acknowledging her actions without excuse or justification. "Lieutenant Commander," Martinez asked, "did you believe you were acting within your authority when you fired those missiles?" "No, ma'am. I knew I was exceeding my authority." "Then why did you do it?" Raven looked at the jury, seeing in their faces the weight of command, the burden of making life-and-death decisions. "Because 43 Marines were about to die, and I had the power to save them." "Even knowing it would end your career?" "Even knowing it would end my life." Sullivan's cross-examination was relentless, forcing her to admit each violation, each breach of protocol, each moment of disobedience. But her answers never wavered, never showed regret or uncertainty. "Do you feel any remorse for destroying a $60 million aircraft?" he asked. "I feel remorse that it was necessary," she replied, "but I would do it again." even knowing that it undermines military discipline. I hope it reinforces the principle that our highest duty is to preserve life, not to follow orders. The closing arguments were masterful displays of legal advocacy. Sullivan painted a picture of military necessity, of the danger of allowing individual conscience to override institutional authority. If we excuse Lieutenant Commander Thorne's actions, he argued, we open the door to chaos. Every soldier will feel justified in disobeying orders they find morally objectionable. Martinez countered with a different vision of military service. The defendant took an oath to defend the Constitution and protect American lives. When those duties conflicted with following orders, she chose the higher calling. That is not a crime. It is the essence of military honor. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, their faces grim with the weight of their decision. When they returned, the foreman, a colonel with 30 years of service, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of willful disobedience of orders, we find the defendant guilty. Raven's face showed no emotion, but she felt something inside her chest tighten. On the charge of destruction of government property, we find the defendant guilty. The tightness spread, but she remained upright, focused on the colonel's words. On the charge of unauthorized use of military assets, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment settling on everyone present. She had been convicted on all counts, facing up to 20 years in prison. But the colonel wasn't finished. However, this jury unanimously recommends clemency, based on the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the defendant's demonstrated courage and moral clarity. The recommendation wasn't binding, but it carried enormous weight. General Morrison would make the final decision about her sentence, but the jury had spoken clearly about their view of her actions. As the court adjourned, Raven felt a strange sense of completion. She had been judged, found guilty, and offered redemption. The legal process had run its course, but the deeper questions remained unanswered. She was escorted back to her cell, where she found a new stack of letters waiting. They came from around the world now, from pilots and soldiers, from families and civilians, from people who had been moved by her story and wanted to express their support. One letter, written in a child's careful handwriting, simply said, "Thank you for saving my daddy." As she read those words, Raven felt the last of her regret fade away. She had made the right choice, paid the price, and earned the gratitude of people whose lives she had touched. Whatever happened next, she could face it with dignity and grace. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but she already knew what she would say when given the chance to speak. She would thank the court for its fairness, acknowledge the validity of the charges, and reaffirm her commitment to the principles that had guided her actions. She would not ask for mercy, because she had already received the greatest mercy of all, the knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning, that her choice had mattered, that 43 Marines were alive because she had been willing to risk everything for their lives. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters returning from patrol, their rotors beating against the thin air. The sound filled her with longing, but also with a deep sense of peace. She had been a pilot, a warrior, a guardian. She had served with honor, made the hard choices, and stood between the innocent and the void. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, she was content to sit in her cell and remember the faces of 43 Marines who would see another dawn, who would return to their families, who would live long and full lives because one woman had chosen to be their guardian angel. The mountain stood silent sentinel over the valley, eternal and unchanging. But in the heart of one grounded pilot, something had been transformed. Duty had become devotion, obedience had become conscience, and service had become sacrifice. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca, Raven, Thorne closed her eyes and dreamed of flying, not through the empty sky, but through the hearts and minds of everyone who had been touched by her story. She had been grounded for disobedience, but she had found her wings in a different kind of flight, the flight of the human spirit toward justice, toward courage, toward the light that shines in the darkness. The guard's footsteps echoed in the corridor, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. She was at peace, knowing that she had lived up to the highest calling of a warrior, to protect the innocent, to serve the cause of justice, and to stand firm in the face of impossible choices. The story of the guardian angel of Khost was far from over. It would be told and retold, becoming legend, inspiring future generations of pilots and soldiers and warriors. But for now, it was enough to know that she had made a difference, that her choice had mattered, that 43 Marines were alive because she had been willing to risk everything for their lives. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the medals or the punishments, not the praise or the condemnation, but the simple fact that she had stood between the innocent and the void, and the innocent had survived. She had been their guardian angel, and that was a role worth any sacrifice. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Lieutenant Commander Rebecca, Raven, Thorn prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that she had lived with honor, served with courage, and loved with the fierce devotion of a warrior who had found her calling in the service of others. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day that seemed to leach color from the world. General Morrison sat behind the judge's bench, his expression grave as he reviewed the jury's recommendation and the voluminous case file. The courtroom was packed once again, with reporters and supporters filling every available seat. Raven stood at attention as the general read the charges and the guilty verdicts. His voice was steady, professional, carrying the weight of military justice and the burden of command decisions. When he finished, he looked directly at her. "Lieutenant Commander Thorn, you have been found guilty on all charges. Do you have anything to say before I pronounce sentence?" She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed the words in her mind during the long nights in her cell. But now, standing before the general who would determine her fate, she found herself speaking from the heart. "General Morrison, I accept full responsibility for my actions. I knew the regulations, I understood the consequences, and I chose to disobey orders because I believed it was the right thing to do. I would make the same choice again." She paused, looking out at the faces in the courtroom, some supportive, some skeptical, all focused on her words. "I became a pilot to serve my country and protect American lives. On that morning, I had a choice between following orders and saving lives. I chose to save lives. I am prepared to accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." General Morrison nodded slowly. "Lieutenant Commander, this court has wrestled with your case for weeks. On one hand, you clearly violated military regulations and destroyed government property. On the other hand, you saved 43 American lives." He stood, his uniform crisp, his bearing that of a career officer who had seen too much war and too much peace. "Military discipline is the foundation of our armed forces. Without it, we have chaos. But military discipline serves a higher purpose, the protection of American lives and the defense of our nation's values. When those purposes conflict, we must choose the higher calling." The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the hammer to fall. "Lieutenant Commander Thorn, you are hereby sentenced to reduction in rank to lieutenant, forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and a reprimand to be placed in your permanent file." The sentence was so light it took a moment for the courtroom to process. No prison time, no dishonorable discharge, no end to her career. Just a slap on the wrist and a notation in her file that would follow her for the rest of her service. But Morrison wasn't finished. "However, this court also finds that your actions, while technically violations of military regulations, were motivated by the highest principles of military service. Therefore, You are also hereby awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States." The courtroom erupted in applause, with reporters scribbling notes and supporters cheering. Raven stood in stunned silence, trying to process the contradictory messages: punishment and reward, censure and honor, all wrapped together in the complex mathematics of military justice. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, raising his voice above the noise, "you are hereby reinstated to flight status, effective immediately. The Air Force needs pilots who can think under pressure and make difficult decisions. You have proven yourself capable of both." As the court adjourned, Raven found herself surrounded by well-wishers, reporters, and the Marines whose lives she had saved. The chaos was overwhelming, but in the center of it all, she felt a deep sense of vindication. She had been judged, found guilty, punished, and honored all in the same moment. The contradictions were perfect, reflecting the impossible complexity of the choice she had made. Colonel Martinez approached with a smile. "Well, Lieutenant, that was unexpected." "Yes, ma'am, I thought I was going to prison." General Morrison is a wise man. He understood that sometimes the letter of the law conflicts with the spirit of justice. "You're free to go." Free? The word felt strange after weeks of confinement. She had become accustomed to the routine of prison life, the simple rhythms of meals and exercise and solitary contemplation. Now she faced the complex challenge of returning to normal life, of being a symbol while trying to be a person. The media attention was intense but manageable. She gave a few interviews, always careful to emphasize that she was just one pilot among many, that her actions were the result of training and duty rather than any special heroism. But privately, she knew that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just Lieutenant Rebecca Thorne. She was the guardian angel of Coast, a living reminder that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest choice. Her first flight back was in a T-38 trainer, a simple aircraft that seemed almost quaint after her experience with the complex systems of the MQ-9 Reaper. But as she climbed into the cockpit and felt the familiar weight of the helmet on her head, she experienced a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. The sky welcomed her back like an old friend. The controls responded to her touch with the precision of a musical instrument, and the aircraft climbed toward the clouds with the eager energy of a bird released from its cage. She flew for 2 hours, practicing basic maneuvers and remembering the simple pleasure of three-dimensional movement. When she finally landed, she sat in the cockpit for a long moment, savoring the sense of completeness that came from being where she belonged. The weeks that followed brought new challenges. She was assigned to a new squadron, one that specialized in close air support missions. The other pilots treated her with a mixture of respect and curiosity, unsure how to relate to someone who had become a legend. But gradually, the novelty wore off. She was just another pilot, with the same responsibilities and the same dangers as everyone else. The only difference was the small scar on her chest where the Distinguished Flying Cross ribbon rested, a reminder of the morning when she had chosen conscience over compliance. The broader implications of her case continued to reverberate through the military. New regulations were written, clarifying the circumstances under which pilots could act independently. Training programs were developed to help officers navigate the complex ethical landscape of modern warfare. But most importantly, a new generation of pilots was learning that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty was disobedience, that sometimes the highest honor was dishonor, and that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest choice. Lieutenant Rebecca Raven Thorne continued to serve with distinction, flying missions over hostile territory and training younger pilots in the art of precision warfare. She never sought publicity or recognition, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But her legend grew anyway, spreading through the ranks like a benevolent virus. She became a symbol of moral courage, a reminder that individuals could make a difference, that one person's choice could change the course of history. Years passed, and she rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a squadron commander herself. She led by example, teaching her pilots that technical skill was important but moral clarity was essential. She showed them that the greatest weapon in their arsenal was not a missile or a bomb, but the willingness to stand up for what was right. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes think about that morning in the command bunker, about the choice that had defined her life. She would remember the faces of the 43 Marines, the weight of the decision, the moment when she pressed the override key and committed herself to a course of action that would echo through the decades. She had been grounded for disobedience, but she had found her wings in a different kind of flight. She had learned that true heroism was not about following orders, but about making the right choice even when it was hard. She had discovered that the greatest victories were sometimes won not in the sky, but in the human heart. The mountains around the base changed with the seasons, wearing snow in winter and green in summer, but always standing as silent sentinels over the valley. They had witnessed her fall and her redemption, her punishment and her vindication. They would outlast her and everyone she had served with, but they would also carry the memory of her choice embedded in their eternal stone. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Raven Thorne, now Colonel Thorne, had become something more than a pilot. She had become a guardian, a protector, a symbol of the principle that sometimes the greatest act of service was the willingness to sacrifice everything for the lives of others. The story of the guardian angel of coast would be told for generations, inspiring future warriors to choose courage over comfort, conscience over compliance, and service over self. But for now, it was enough to know that she had made a difference, that her choice had mattered, that 43 Marines were alive because she had been willing to risk everything for their lives. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the medals or the punishments, not the praise or the condemnation, but the simple fact that she had stood between the innocent and the void, and the innocent had survived. She had been their guardian angel, and that was a role worth any sacrifice. The sky stretched endless and blue above the mountains, beautiful and treacherous as a siren's song. But it was also a realm of infinite possibility, where warriors could become angels, where disobedience could become devotion, and where one person's choice could light the way for all who followed. Colonel Rebecca Raven Thorne looked up at that sky and smiled, knowing that she had earned her place in it not through obedience, but through the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. She had been grounded for disobedience, but she had found her wings in the service of others, and those wings would carry her, and her legacy, far beyond the boundaries of earth and sky. The mountains stood silent witness to her transformation, eternal guardians watching over the guardian who had chosen to protect the innocent at any cost. And in the distance, barely audible above the wind, came the sound of helicopters returning from patrol, their rotors beating against the thin air like the wings of metal angels carrying their crews safely home. It was the sound of service, of sacrifice, of the eternal vigilance that kept the darkness at bay. And at the heart of it all was the memory of one woman who had chosen to be more than a soldier. She had chosen to be a guardian, a protector, a light in the darkness that would never be extinguished. The story of the guardian angel of coast was complete, but its echoes would ring through the ages, inspiring future generations to choose courage over comfort, conscience over compliance, and service over self. For in the end, that was what true heroism meant, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, to stand up for what was right even when it was hard, and to sacrifice everything for the lives of others. Colonel Rebecca Raven Thorne had learned that lesson well, and she had taught it to the world through her actions. She had been grounded for disobedience, but she had found her wings in the service of others, and those wings would carry her legacy far beyond the boundaries of earth and sky, into the realm of legend where heroes live forever.